I'm Jason with Born Handy, and today's video is all about air conditioning maintenance and whether or not it's something that you should be doing in your home. I think the number one question that I get from customers is it worth it? And probably the most common objection that I hear is that people don't remember their parents ever getting their air conditioner maintenance, and so they just can't understand why it's something that we should do today. Not only is that a very good question, but there's also a very good answer. Simply put, as old units wear out, they're being replaced by federally mandated systems that have to meet both energy efficiency requirements and environmental requirements. And so these systems are oftentimes very much more expensive and almost always a whole lot more complicated than the system that they're replacing. Both of those regulatory requirements have an impact on why you need to have your system maintenance, but the big one, of course, is the environmental regulation, because new refrigerants have to be used that weren't used on your parents' systems, and those newer refrigerants operate at a much higher PSI than the older refrigerants did, and that higher PSI means that catastrophic failures are not only more likely, but they're also more common. And so the idea of allowing an air conditioning system to operate without ever having it inspected or maintained is just not as viable of an idea as it was 20 years ago. The most common impact of not having your system maintenance is simply a loss of efficiency. Loss of efficiency may not raise an eyebrow for most people, but it's also worth considering that in the part of the country where I live, the air conditioning system is responsible for about 65% of the total electrical usage in a person's home, and so loss of efficiency can have a huge impact when it's your air conditioning system. It just wouldn't take more than a few months of low efficiency for you to have spent the money that you would have cost in having a maintenance done on an electric bill instead. Having regular maintenance can also identify weak or failing components. Your technician also may discover that your refrigerant is low or leaking, or even that the initial installation was incorrectly done. Just a few days before I shot this video, I was at a house where the system itself wasn't that old, but the electrical system had been done improperly and a fire hazard existed in the disconnect box on the outside of the home. Heat generated by connecting a wire too loosely caused the plastic to begin to melt, the insulation to burn off the wire, and the potential certainly existed for a house fire to have developed inside of the walls of that home. Animal activity inside of systems that also can cause premature failures. And it's more common than you may think, but mold is often discovered inside of systems due to a faulty initial installation. That's a pretty long list of things, so I'm just going to basically put it in a nutshell and talk about what system maintenances do versus what system maintenances don't do. Having your system regularly serviced can find and prevent issues that are not necessarily large enough to cause a problem today, but would be a problem if left unchecked. Maintains the efficiency of the system, and preserves the life of the components and the system as a whole. What regular maintenances don't do is they do not mean that your system is going to last forever just because you had it regularly maintained. At the end of the day, systems get old, and just having it maintained does not suddenly mean that the system is immortal. All it really means is that the system should be allowed to live out its full life expectancy without some premature failure causing you to have to replace it before you should. Pretty much anybody can identify with the fact that a well-maintained automobile will outlast an automobile that's been neglected, and the same is true of the air conditioning systems. As long as you maintain these systems, they will outlast systems that are not going to be maintained in almost every case. If you think about it in terms of numbers, you don't want the reason that you had to replace a $2,500 compressor or the entire system to be because you allowed a $200 problem to exist 1 or 2 days longer than it should have existed. These systems are very complex, and they can operate even if a problem exists, and so oftentimes we have a false sense of security that nothing's wrong with our unit when in fact we have a failing component that's moving us closer day by day until we reach that failure point, and you have to call a technician. And the last thing that anybody wants to hear from a technician is that they need a new compressor because a capacitor had failed. Who is a good candidate for regular maintenance? Well, the answer to that is it is a best practice, pretty much everybody, but I know that not everybody's going to get it done, so I'm going to run down the basic reasons that you would want to get maintenances done, and then you can decide whether or not it's something that you would want to invest your money in. Let's start with somebody who thinks that they are the last person who would need a system maintenance, somebody who just got a new system or bought a new house maybe about a year ago. A second set of eyes just might find that an improper installation is allowing condensation to build up inside the ductwork rather than draining outside like it's supposed to. And now, in addition to a new system and a comfortable house, you also have about 8 feet of mold growing in the first part of your ductwork. And nobody wants a mold farm, especially not in a new house with a new system. And that's just one example. There's a whole lot of other reasons to have a system inspected. But moving on, I'm going to go to the person who maybe seems like they might be a little bit more interested in having a system maintenance, but they're just not quite sure. 3 to 5 years is when I, as a technician, see a lot of systems that have their initial failures in components. And so this is a good time to, at very least, start getting an annual inspection. Dirty coils almost always lead to a weak capacitor because dirty coils cause the compressor to work harder than it should have to work, and then of course in turn the compressor puts extra work on the capacitor in order to keep up, and the capacitor begins to fail. This creates a cycle that kind of runs away with itself and will burn up a compressor entirely, because as the capacitor gets weaker, the compressor pulls more and more amperage and becomes hotter and hotter and less able to cool itself, and certainly less able to operate efficiently. It's definitely worth keeping in mind that I have never been to a system that had a failed compressor where the coils were clean and the capacitor was in good shape. Beyond 5 years, twice a year is best practice. And I know that most people don't do it that frequently, but I'm going to go ahead and say that I've replaced a lot of units that were 7 or 8 years old, and in almost every single one of those instances, those units had never been maintained, not even one time during the life of that system. On the flip side of that coin, I regularly maintenance systems that are 15, 16, and sometimes even 20 years old, and those systems have seen regular maintenance beginning at some point earlier in their life of operation, and those systems, for the most part, are still going strong today. There's just no denying the fact that new systems are more sensitive to neglect than older systems were, and there's also no denying the fact that a system that sees regular maintenance is almost guaranteed to outlast a system that never sees a maintenance during its usable life. Getting advice like this plant is too close to your condenser, or this particular plant is dropping a lot of fuzz and it's clogging the coils and causing problems can be very valuable advice, considering that even an inexpensive system is going to be at least $5,000 or $6,000. And when you add that to the fact that most people only have one system in their homes, and most people are not able to cough up that kind of money on a moment's notice, so keeping a system from failing in the first place is far more affordable than having to replace a system unexpectedly. It just makes sense when you consider that a single maintenance costs under $100, and if it allows a system to last 12 or 13 years as opposed to 7 or 8 years, it's absolutely worth it in the long run. And if you had a question that I didn't cover in this video, be sure and drop that question in the comments, and I'll try to answer it down there, or maybe in a later video on down the road. So until next time, this is Jason with Born Handy, wishing your air conditioning system a long life.